The words didn't register at first. They hung suspended in the air between us, hovering like smoke in the living room where I'd taught him to build pillow forts as a child. You're useless. 3 syllables that demolished 60 years of existence, 40 years of fatherhood, and the unspoken covenant between parent and child. My son Thomas stood before me, his 6-foot frame towering over my now-stooped shoulders, his face contorted with contempt I never thought I'd see directed at me. I felt the blow physically, as though someone had reached beneath my ribs and squeezed. The pain radiated outward, stealing my breath, making my hands tremble against the armrest of the chair Margaret and I had purchased when we first moved into this colonial-style house on Maple Street. Margaret, my sweet Margaret, who had been gone for 5 years now. She would have never believed our boy capable of such cruelty. "Did you hear me, Dad?" Thomas pressed, his voice sharper now, impatient. His expensive watch glinted under the light as he gestured toward the stack of medical bills on the coffee table. "This is the 3rd time this year. I can't keep bailing you out. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my finances? To Emily and the kids?" I looked up at my son, this stranger wearing the face of the boy who once ran to me with skinned knees and school art projects, and wondered when exactly I had lost him. Was it after college when he took that corporate job in the city? Was it when Margaret died? Or had it been happening incrementally, so slowly that I failed to notice until this moment of awful clarity? "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words automatic, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. For growing old? For the heart condition that had plagued me since my 50s? For becoming a burden when I had sworn I never would? Thomas raked his fingers through his graying hair that had begun to thin in the same pattern as mine. "Sorry doesn't pay the bills, Dad. Emily says we might have to postpone our vacation to Bali because of this. The kids were looking forward to it for months." Bali, the exotic destination, flashed in my mind alongside the memory of Thomas at 10. Thrilled beyond measure with our weekend camping trips to the lake just 30 miles from home. We couldn't afford exotic vacations then. Margaret and I had put everything into mortgage for this house, into Thomas's education, into building the kind of stability my own childhood had lacked. I could sell some of my woodworking tools. I offered, knowing even as I said how inadequate the gesture was. The collection I had built over decades might fetch a few thousand, a drop in the ocean of medical debt. Thomas snorted. "Your little hobby? Dad, be serious. What you need to do is consider selling this place. It's too big for one person anyway. The property taxes alone are killing you. The house, our home, the place where Margaret had planted the rose garden that still bloomed each spring, though my arthritic hands struggled to maintain it now. The kitchen where I'd taught Thomas to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. The bedroom where Margaret had taken her last breath, holding my hand, making me promise to be strong. "I'm not selling the house," I said, finding a firmness in my voice that surprised us both. Something darkened in Thomas's eyes then. A calculation, a resentment long simmering beneath the surface. "You know it'll be mine eventually anyway," he said coldly. "Why put us both through financial strain when you could move into Pine Valley Retirement Community? They have medical staff on site. It makes sense. Pine Valley, the place we used to joke about when passing its manicured grounds. When I'm old and gray, just wheel me in and leave me by the bingo table." I'd tease Margaret, but it had been just that, a joke. The thought of leaving our home had never been a serious consideration. "This house is all I have left of your mother," I said quietly. Thomas's laugh was brittle. "Mom's gone, Dad. And frankly, she'd be practical about this. She wouldn't want you clinging to a house you can't afford just because of sentiment." The casual invocation of what Margaret would want ignited something in me, a slow-burning anger I hadn't felt in years. He hadn't been there during those final months. He'd been too busy with work, with his own family, visiting only on weekends while I tended to her every need, memorized every medication schedule, held her through the pain when the morphine wasn't enough. "Don't tell me what your mother would want," I said, my voice low but steady. Thomas checked his watch again, impatient. "Look, I have a conference call in 20 minutes. I need to head back. Think about what I said. We can't keep doing this." And then, as he reached for his designer coat, The final blow. You need to be practical for once in your life. Stop being so useless and make a decision that actually helps everyone. Useless. The word echoed in the silence that followed, bouncing off the walls of the home I'd built with my own two hands, renovating nights and weekends while holding down two jobs. Useless, when I'd worked 60-hour weeks to put him through college without student loans. Useless, when I'd taught him to drive, to shave, to be a man I thought I could be proud of. I should have been angry. I should have shouted, reminded him of all I'd sacrificed. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, a clarity I hadn't experienced since Margaret's diagnosis. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and saw not just his cruelty, but his fear. Fear of responsibility, of mortality, of ending up just like me. And I smiled. It was a small smile, one that clearly unnerved him because he took a step back, his brow furrowing. "What?" he demanded. "Nothing," I said softly. "You'd better get to your call." Thomas hesitated, perhaps sensing something had shifted, but the pull of his important life was stronger. He left without another word, the front door closing with a decisive click behind him, alone in the sudden quiet. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting for so long. I walked to the mantel where our family photos were displayed, Thomas's graduation, his wedding, the birth of his children. I touched each frame gently, these milestones of a life I'd helped create, but somehow no longer had a meaningful place in. And I made a decision. That night, after Thomas left, I didn't cry. Tears seemed inadequate for the hollow feeling that had settled in my chest. Instead, I moved through the house with purpose, touching door frames and windowsills, running my fingers along the banister Margaret had insisted we restore rather than replace. Each room held memories, some joyful, some painful, all precious. In Thomas's old bedroom, now converted to a guest room that had never hosted a guest, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the nightstand drawer. Inside was a small leather journal Margaret had given me after her diagnosis. "Write down what matters," she'd said, "so you remember when things get fuzzy." I hadn't written in it since her funeral. I picked up a pen and began to write, my handwriting more unsteady than it once was, but still legible. I wrote about Thomas's visit, about being called useless, about the strange calm that had washed over me afterward. I wrote about the decision forming in my mind, not born of anger or revenge, but of something deeper, a reclamation. When the clock downstairs chimed midnight, I closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer. Then I walked to the closet and pulled out an old leather suitcase, the one Margaret and I had used on our honeymoon to Niagara Falls. It smelled faintly of mothballs and her perfume, a combination that tightened my throat but didn't break my resolve. By dawn, I had made several calls to old friends, people I had neglected in my years of caring for Margaret and then wallowing in grief after her passing. Jim Sullivan, my buddy from the factory where I'd worked for 30 years before retirement, answered on the first ring despite the early hour. "Harold? Everything okay?" His voice was thick with sleep, but instantly concerned. "Need a favor, Jim," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You still know people in real estate?" By 8 in the morning, I was showered, dressed, and waiting for Jim's daughter Melissa, who had become a successful real estate agent in the years since I had last seen her. She arrived punctually, professional but with kind eyes that reminded me of her mother. "Mr. Lawson." She greeted me with genuine warmth, embracing me briefly before getting down to business. "Dad said you're interested in selling?" I have to say, I was surprised. "You've been here forever." "It's time for a change," I replied simply. Melissa nodded, not pushing for elaboration. She walked through the house with me, making notes on her tablet, occasionally stopping to admire Margaret's touches that still lingered in the decor. In the kitchen, she paused by the hand-painted tiles above the stove, a weekend project Margaret and I had completed together when Thomas was still in elementary school. "These are charming," she said. "Very unique. Buyers love character." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak about the weekend we'd spent laughing and covered in paint. Thomas helping by handing us tiles one by one. So proud to be included in the grown-up project. In my office, Melissa pulled up comparable properties on her tablet. "The market's hot right now. Low inventory. Your location is excellent, and the house has good bones, though some buyers might want to update a few things. How quickly can we sell? I asked, cutting to the chase. Melissa looked up, surprised. Well, traditionally we'd stage the home, take professional photos, list it, hold open houses. That process usually takes. I don't want traditional, I interrupted gently. I want quick and discreet. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Jim must have told her something of my situation. I do have a couple who lost out on a bidding war last month. They love this neighborhood. They might be willing to make a competitive offer without the house going on the market. Make the call, I said. By noon, the couple, young professionals expecting their first child, were walking through my home, their eyes wide with possibility. I stayed in the background, letting Melissa guide them, watching as they envisioned their own life in these rooms. The woman, clearly pregnant, lingered in what had been Thomas's nursery, her hand resting on her belly, a small smile playing at her lips. Something about her expression, hopeful, tender, full of dreams for her unborn child, cemented my resolve. This house deserved a family who valued it, who would fill it with the love and respect it had known before. They made an offer on the spot, slightly below market value in exchange for a 2-week closing and the furniture they'd admired. I accepted without haggling. Money wasn't the point. As Melissa prepared the paperwork at my dining room table, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Thought more about what we discussed? Pine Valley has an opening next month. Emily and I can come help you look this weekend. I set the phone down without responding and picked up the pen Melissa offered me. With each signature, I felt lighter, as though I was signing away not just property, but the weight of expectations and disappointment. When the young couple left, the woman impulsively hugged me, whispering, "Thank you," in my ear. Her gratitude was the first genuine emotion directed at me in months, and I found myself blinking back unexpected tears. Melissa stayed behind to finalize details. "I need to ask, Mr. Lawson, does your family know about this decision?" I met her gaze steadily. "They'll know soon enough." She nodded, recognizing the dignity in my choice not to elaborate. "Where will you go?" she asked softly. I smiled then, thinking of the conversation Margaret and I had on our 30th anniversary, when we'd stayed up late drinking wine and planning the travels we'd embark on after retirement, dreams deferred by illness and then death. "Somewhere I should have gone a long time ago," I replied. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of Margaret's favorite bourbon, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The roses she planted swayed gently in the breeze, their fragrance carrying memories of Sunday afternoons spent gardening together while Thomas played in the sprinkler. My phone rang twice more, Thomas, then Emily. I let both calls go to voicemail. There would be time for explanations, for consequences. But this moment, this decision, was mine alone. In the silence of the gathering dusk, I raised my glass to the empty chair beside me. "You were right, Maggie," I whispered to the woman who had known me better than I knew myself. It was never about the house. I hadn't raised my voice when Thomas called me useless. I hadn't defended myself or reminded him of all I'd given. Instead, I had smiled and found power in silence, dignity in action rather than words. And in that dignity, I had discovered something I thought I'd lost when Margaret died, myself. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of practical arrangements and private planning. I moved with a quiet efficiency that had once made me a valued foreman at the factory, methodical, thorough, leaving nothing to chance. Each day brought a new task, sorting through 40 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what to keep, donate, or discard. It was both painful and liberating. Margaret's things were the hardest to address. Her clothing still hung in our closet. Her reading glasses still rested on her nightstand. I'd been unable to part with them after she died, finding comfort in the illusion that she might walk back into the room at any moment. Now, I carefully wrapped her most precious items. Her mother's pearl necklace, the first edition Austen novels I'd hunted down for her 50th birthday, the hand-knit sweater she'd worn on our last Christmas together. These treasures I placed in a safety deposit box at First National, along with a letter addressed to my granddaughter Lily, to be given to her on her 21st birthday. Lily, at 16, was the only one who still looked at me with genuine affection, who called weekly just to chat, who seemed to have inherited her grandmother's kindness rather than her father's calculation. Thomas called daily now, his messages growing increasingly confused, then concerned, then irritated. I let them all go to voicemail, a small act of rebellion that gave me more satisfaction than I cared to admit. Emily texted twice about the Pine Valley appointment they'd scheduled without consulting me. I canceled it with a brief email to the facility. On the morning of closing day, I walked through the empty house one last time. The furniture the young couple didn't want had been donated to a women's shelter. My tools had gone to Jim's grandson, who was studying carpentry. The family photos had been carefully packed, along with a small box of Thomas's childhood mementos I couldn't bring myself to discard despite everything. In what had been our bedroom, I stood by the window where Margaret and I had watched countless storms roll in, marveling at nature's fury from the safety of each other's arms. I placed my palm against the glass and whispered a final goodbye, not just to the house, but to the man I had been here, the man who had gradually allowed himself to be diminished by his own son's expectations. At the title company, I signed the final papers with steady hands. The proceeds, nearly $450,000 after the mortgage was paid off, were wired directly to my newly established account at a different bank than the one Thomas had access to as my emergency contact. The young woman buying my house cried when I handed her the keys, her husband's arm supportive around her shoulders. They promised to take care of the roses. Ready for phase 2? Jim asked as we walked out of the title company. He'd been my staunchest supporter through this process, driving me to appointments, helping me move boxes, never once questioning my decision, even when I'd shared the full story of Thomas's behavior. More than ready? I replied. Phase 2 began at Meridian Trust with Valerie Chun, the financial advisor Margaret, and I had consulted when planning for retirement. Valerie had aged like fine wine, her black hair now streaked with distinguished silver, her mind as sharp as ever. She didn't hide her surprise when I walked into her office after 5 years of absence. Harold, she said warmly, rising to shake my hand. This is unexpected. I was sorry to hear about Margaret. Thank you, I said, taking a seat across from her desk. I need to make some changes to my financial arrangements. For the next hour, Valerie and I reconstructed my financial landscape. The house proceeds were divided. $200,000 into a conservative investment portfolio, $50,000 into a high-yield savings account for immediate living expenses, and $100,000 into a charitable remainder trust benefiting the cardiac care unit that had treated Margaret with such compassion. And the remaining funds? Valerie asked, her fingers poised over her keyboard. I'd like to establish educational trusts for my grandchildren, I said, but with specific conditions. Lily and her younger brother Sam would each have access to their funds at age 25, but only for education, medical emergencies, or first home purchase. Thomas and Emily would have no control over the money. Most importantly, the existence of these trusts would remain confidential until I chose to reveal them. And your current will? Valerie asked carefully. It still names Thomas as primary beneficiary and executor. That changes today, I replied, placing a folder on her desk. Papers prepared by a lawyer Jim had recommended, one with no connections to Thomas or his firm. The new will was simple and direct. My remaining assets would be divided between the grandchildren's trusts and several charities Margaret had supported. Thomas would receive a single bequest. His father's collection of vintage records, along with a handwritten journal I'd started the night he called me useless. Harold, Valerie said gently after reviewing the documents, this is a significant change. Are you certain? I met her gaze steadily. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. As I left Meridian Trust, my phone rang again. Thomas. This time, I answered. Dad? Finally. Where have you been? I've been calling for 2 weeks. I've been busy, I replied calmly, sliding into Jim's waiting car. Busy? Doing what? Emily drove by the house yesterday and said there was a strange car in the driveway. What's going on? The moment had arrived. I took a deep breath, savoring the strange power that came with holding information someone desperately wanted. I sold the house, Thomas. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Then, "You what?" "Sold it. Closed this morning. Lovely young couple. She's expecting their first baby. Without discussing it with me, without even telling me." His voice rose with each word, indignation and shock battling for dominance. "Where you go to live? What about all the furniture, Mom's things? Did you at least get market value?" The barrage of questions, all focused on logistics, on possessions, on money, only confirmed I had made the right decision. "I've made arrangements," I said simply. "Arrangements? What does that mean?" "Dad, this is insane. You can't just sell the house on a whim." "What about my money?" I finished for him, an edge creeping into my voice despite my determination to remain calm. "Isn't that what you're really asking about, Thomas? What happened to your inheritance?" Another stunned silence. Then more carefully, "I'm concerned about your welfare. This seems very impulsive." "On the contrary," I replied, "I've been thinking about it ever since you called me useless in the living room of the home I spent 40 years paying for." The sharp intake of breath told me the barb had landed. "Dad, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. And that's okay, son. It was clarifying, actually. Helped me see things as they really are." "Where are you?" he demanded, his corporate crisis management tone taking over. "I'm coming to pick you up. We need to discuss this rationally." "I'm not available," I said. "I'll be in touch soon." "Dad, don't you dare hang up this phone." I ended the call and turned off my phone completely. Beside me, Jim chuckled as he navigated toward the interstate. "He didn't take it well?" he asked. "About as expected," I replied, feeling strangely light despite the confrontation. "Next stop?" Jim grinned as he accelerated onto the highway. "Airport. Your chariot awaits, you vengeful old bastard." I laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in years. The strategic rearrangement of my finances wasn't just about denying Thomas control of my assets, though that was certainly satisfying. It was about reclaiming the power I gradually ceded to him, about asserting that my life and resources would serve my values, not his expectations. As we drove, I thought of what Margaret would say about all this. I could almost hear her practical voice. "It's not revenge if it's just setting healthy boundaries, Harold." But then I could also hear the smile in her voice as she added, "But if it feels a little like revenge too, well, I won't tell anyone." Beside me on the seat lay my passport, recently renewed, and a one-way ticket to Lisbon. The first stop on the journey Margaret and I had mapped out all those years ago, when possibilities seemed endless and time felt abundant. In my carry-on was a journal with the itinerary we'd planned, now updated and expanded. Thomas would eventually discover the full extent of my financial restructuring. The trusts, the donations, the disinheritance. He would be furious, then calculating, then perhaps, if I was fortunate, reflective. But that was a problem for future Thomas. For now, I had a plane to catch and a promise to keep to the woman who had loved me enough to make me promise I would truly live after she was gone. 3 months passed in a blur of sunlit plazas, ancient cathedrals, and cobblestone streets. Portugal welcomed me with open arms. The gentle pace of life in Lisbon's historic neighborhoods, the melodic cadence of language I was slowly learning, the kindness of strangers who became friends. I rented a small apartment in Alfama, where laundry fluttered from balconies and the mournful sounds of fado music drifted through open windows at night. Every morning, I walked to a local cafe where Teresa, the owner, would greet me by name and prepare my coffee without asking. "Bom dia, Senor Harold," she'd say, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "How is your Portuguese today?" We'd practice together as I stumbled through basic phrases, her patience never wearing thin. In the evenings, I'd sit on my balcony overlooking the Tagus River, writing postcards to Lily and Sam. I never mentioned their father, focusing instead on describing the sights, sounds, and tastes of my new life. To Lily, who loved art, I sent detailed account of the azulejos, the blue and white tiles adorning buildings throughout the city. To Sam, fascinated by ships in the sea, I described the maritime history museums and the great vessels that still docked in the harbor. I never sent a return address. Once a week, I checked my email at an internet cafe near Ratio Square. Lily responded to every postcard with enthusiastic messages full of teenage exuberance and genuine concern for my well-being. Sam, only 11, sent shorter notes, often focused on practical questions. Do they have good ice cream there? Have you seen any sharks in the ocean? Their innocence was a balm to my soul. Emily wrote twice, stilted, formal messages that thinly veiled her confusion and anger. I responded with brief, polite replies that revealed nothing about my location or intentions. Thomas didn't email at all, though Lily mentioned in passing that her father was super stressed and working too much. It was on a warm Tuesday in June, as I sat enjoying grilled sardines at a seaside restaurant in Cascais, that my temporary phone rang. The prepaid Portuguese number only Jim and Melissa Sullivan had. Concerned, I answered immediately. "Harold, it's Melissa." Her voice sounded strained, professional composure barely containing urgency. "Thomas showed up at my office today." I set down my fork, suddenly not hungry. "How did he find you?" "Small town, word gets around. Someone mentioned I'd handled your house sale." He was insistent. "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely regretful that my actions had caused her discomfort. "Did he threaten you?" "No, nothing like that. But he's desperate, Harold. Something's happened." My heart stuttered. "The kids?" "They're fine," she assured me quickly. "It's financial." He didn't give me details, but reading between the lines, I think he's in trouble. Serious trouble. He was hoping to access your house proceeds. The irony wasn't lost on me. My useless financial decisions had apparently been the foundation Thomas had been counting on. "What did you tell him?" "That I had no information about your current whereabouts or financial arrangements. Attorney-client privilege." Her voice softened. "He looked terrible, Harold, like he hasn't slept in weeks." A complicated tangle of emotions knotted in my chest. Concern warring with vindication. Parental worry battling the still raw hurt of his betrayal. "Thank you for letting me know," I said finally. After ending the call, I sat watching the Atlantic waves crash against the shore, thinking about Thomas as a boy, his determination to build the perfect sandcastle, his frustration when the tide inevitably claimed it. Had I failed to teach him that nothing material ever truly belongs to us? That everything is, in the end, on loan? That night, I did something I'd avoided for months. I called Valerie Chin at her direct number, calculated for East Coast business hours. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said without preamble. "Your son has been quite persistent. Melissa Sullivan mentioned he might be in financial trouble. Valerie's side carried across the Atlantic. I can't discuss another client's finances with you, Harold. Thomas is a client of yours now. Has been for years. His firm manages several pension funds we work with." She paused meaningfully. "What I can tell you, as your advisor, is that there have been rumors about Westridge Partners recently. Nothing public yet, but concerns about some of their investment strategies. Westridge Partners, Thomas's firm, the prestigious financial management company he joined straight out of business school, working his way up to junior partner through years of 60-hour weeks and missed family dinners." "How serious?" I asked. "Serious enough that if I had any exposure there, I'd be diversifying immediately." After thanking her and promising to actually come home for a visit soon, I made another call, this one to Jim Sullivan. "Need a favor," I said after exchanging pleasantries. "Can you keep an eye on my grandkids? Just make sure they're okay." "Already am," Jim replied. "Lily babysits for my granddaughter sometimes. Smart kid. Worried about her dad, though." The knot in my chest tightened. "Why is that?" "Word around town is Westridge might be the next financial scandal headline. Thomas has been with them from the beginning, right?" I thanked Jim and ended the call, my mind racing. Then I did something I had promised myself I wouldn't do for at least a year. I booked a flight back to the States. 48 hours later, I was sitting in a rental car outside Thomas's suburban home, the 5-bedroom Tudor-style house he purchased when he made partner, with a 3-car garage and professionally landscaped yard. It was 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and I knew from Lily's emails that she had debate team practice until 9. I wanted to speak to Thomas alone first. The Thomas who opened the door barely resembled the polished, confident man who had called me useless just months before. His face was haggard, with several days' worth of stubble. The crisp suits he favored had been replaced by a rumpled button-down and jeans. Most striking was his expression when he recognized me. Not anger, but naked relief that quickly morphed into shame. "Dad," he breathed, his voice cracking slightly. "Hello, Thomas," I said quietly. "May I come in?" He stepped back wordlessly, running a hand through hair that needed cutting. Inside, the immaculate home Emily took such pride in showing off at holiday gatherings was showing signs of neglect. Mail piled on the console table, dishes in the sink visible from the entryway, a fine layer of dust on the side tables. "Emily's at her mother's with Sam," Thomas said, following my gaze around the room. "She needed space." I nodded, understanding the euphemism. "And Lily?" "Debate team. She's the only thing keeping together, honestly." He gave a hollow laugh. 16 going on 40. Keeps telling me everything will work out. We moved to the kitchen, where Thomas mechanically offered coffee. As he fumbled with the expensive machine, a Christmas gift from Emily's parents. His hands trembled slightly. "How bad is it?" I asked finally. Thomas stilled his back to me. For a moment, I thought he might deny knowing what I meant, might cling to the last shreds of his pride. Instead, his shoulders slumped. "Bad," he admitted, turned to face me. "The SEC is investigating Westridge. Irregular accounting, client funds misappropriated for high-risk investments." I swear I didn't know, Dad. Not at first. But eventually, I pressed gently. He sank into a chair across from me, suddenly looking very young despite the gray in his hair, like the boy who confessed to breaking a window with his baseball, rather than the man who'd coldly calculated my financial worth. There were signs, questions I didn't ask, warnings I ignored because the bonuses were so good. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm going to lose everything. My job, possibly my license. If criminal charges come, I could go to prison." The coffee maker beeped, but neither of us moved. "The house is mortgaged to the hilt," he continued, words spilling out now. "We took equity out for investments, renovations, vacations. Emily's family money is tied up in trusts. I've been looking for liquid assets, anything to pay for legal representation." And there it was, the real reason for his hunt for me, for the house proceeds. Not concern for my well-being, but desperation for a financial lifeline. I should have felt vindicated. This man who had dismissed me as useless was now facing the consequences of his own poor decisions. The cosmic justice was almost too perfect. Instead, I felt only a profound sadness for the boy I'd raised who had lost his way, for Lily and Sam, whose comfortable lives were about to be upended, even for Emily, who had always treated me with cordial indifference but didn't deserve this upheaval. "When I couldn't find you," Thomas continued, his voice hollow, "when I discovered you'd sold the house without telling me, it was like the last safety net was gone. I've been scrambling ever since." He finally looked up, meeting my eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years. "I said terrible things to you, unforgivable things. I treated you like an asset instead of my father. I don't expect your forgiveness or your help. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you left." The silence that settled between us was heavy with decades of expectations, disappointments, love, and hurt. Outside, the sprinklers came on, the mechanical rhythm counting the seconds as we sat in the gathering dusk. "Do Lily and Sam know?" I asked finally. Thomas shook his head. "We've told them there's some trouble at work, that we might need to cut back for a while. Emily thinks we should sell the house, move somewhere smaller. I've been resistant." The irony hung unspoken between us. "Now you understand," I said softly, "why I couldn't sell the house when you wanted me to. It wasn't just about memories, Thomas. It was about dignity, about not being valued only for what I could provide materially." He flinched but nodded. "I do now. Too late, but I do." In the distance, car headlights swept across the front windows as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Lily's debate coach dropping her off, most likely. I stood, suddenly needing air, time to think. I should go before she sees me. I wasn't planning to. I need to process this. Thomas rose too, panic flashing across his face. Will you at least tell me how to reach you? Where you're staying? The old Thomas would have demanded, would have made assumptions about my return, signaling a reconciliation, an opening of my wallet. This Thomas just looked broken, expecting nothing. I'm at the Marriott downtown, I said after a moment's consideration. Room 412. I'll be there until Monday. Relief flooded his face. Not the calculating relief of a financial solution, but the simple relief of not being completely abandoned. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming back, for listening. As I slipped out the back door, avoiding Lily's entrance, I heard Thomas greet his daughter with forced cheerfulness. Her teenage voice, brightening the somber house, followed me into gathering darkness. Back in my hotel room, I sat for hours looking out at the city lights, thinking about the transformative power of consequences. Thomas had finally realized what I'd learned in a much quieter way, that our choices compound, that what we prioritize shapes who we become, that treating people as means rather than ends eventually hollows out the soul. The question now was what to do with this realization. The vengeful part of me, the part still smarting from being called useless, whispered that Thomas had made his bed and should lie in it. Let him experience the full weight of his decisions. Let him learn the hard way, as I had learned to live without Margaret. But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like Margaret herself, reminded me that vengeance had never been the point. The point had been reclamation of my dignity, my autonomy, my future. And now that I had achieved that, perhaps there was room for something else. Not a bailout, not a rescue, but a bridge, a way forward that honored both what had been broken and what might still be salvaged. I reached for my phone and composed a text to Thomas. Breakfast tomorrow, 8 a.m., hotel restaurant. Bring copies of everything, financial statements, legal documents, all of it. His reply came instantly. I'll be there. Thank you, Dad. I set the phone aside and pulled out my journal, turning to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, the way forward. Then I began to plan, not just for Thomas, but for all of us, for the family we had been, and for the family we might still become, altered, humbled, but perhaps ultimately stronger for having been broken and remade. The morning sunlight streamed to the hotel restaurant windows, casting long shadows across the table where Thomas and I sat surrounded by papers. Financial statements, legal notices, bank records, and mortgage documents. He brought everything as requested. The physical manifestation of his unraveling life, contained in color-coded folders that Emily had organized before taking Sam to her mother's. Thomas looked marginally better than he had the night before, freshly shaven, wearing a pressed shirt, but the dark circles under his eyes told of another sleepless night. He'd arrived 15 minutes early, nervously checking his watch every few minutes until I appeared. I've been up since 4, he admitted as we ordered coffee, trying to figure out what to say to you. Let's start with the facts, I replied, not unkindly but firmly establishing the tone. This wouldn't be an emotional plea, but a clear-eyed assessment. For the next hour, Thomas walked me through the situation. Westridge Partners have been inflating returns on their managed funds for years, using new client investments to pay existing clients, a sophisticated Ponzi scheme wrapped in legitimate-seeming financial instruments. As a junior partner, Thomas hadn't been privy to the highest-level decisions, but he had ignored red flags, signed off on documents without sufficient scrutiny, and participated in selling products he didn't fully understand. The managing partners will face criminal charges, he explained, his coffee growing cold beside him. For the rest of us, it depends on what the investigation finds about individual knowledge and involvement. Worst case scenario? I asked. Thomas swallowed hard. 5 to 10 years. More likely, industry ban, heavy fines, possible suspended sentence if I cooperate. I nodded, processing this. And financially? Legal fees will be at least $150,000, possibly much more. The house is underwater after the market correction. Last year, credit cards are maxed. Emily's family is willing to help with the kids' education, but they've made it clear they won't fund my defense. His voice cracked slightly. Can't blame them. I studied my son's face, the face that had once looked up at me with complete trust as I taught him to ride a bike, to drive a car, to shave. Somewhere along the way, that trust had transformed into assessment, then dismissal. Now, humbled by circumstances, he looked at me with something new, a wary hope tinged with shame. "I've made arrangements," I said finally, echoing the words I'd said to him months ago when he demanded to know my plans after selling the house. Thomas's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" I pulled out my own folder, documents I'd spent half the night preparing after speaking with Valerie Chun and my attorney via late-night video calls. "These are the terms," I said, sliding the papers across to him. "Non-negotiable." Thomas looked confused but opened the folder. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents, then looked up at me in disbelief. "You're going to help me?" "I'm going to help the family," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." The documents outline my conditions. I would provide $100,000 for Thomas's legal defense, but the money would go directly to the law firm, not to Thomas. Additionally, I would purchase a modest 3-bedroom house in a good school district to be held in trust for Lily and Sam, with Thomas and Emily as tenants with the right to live there as long as the children were under 18. In exchange, Thomas would fully cooperate with investigators, regardless of the consequences to himself or former colleagues, attend weekly financial counseling and family therapy sessions, take whatever legitimate work he could find after the legal proceedings were concluded, no matter how humble, agree to transparently involve me in the family's financial decisions until both children were in college. At the bottom of the document was a final condition, perhaps the most important one. Thomas would commit to spending 1 weekend a month volunteering at the Cardiac Care Center, where Margaret had been treated, for a minimum of 5 years. "This isn't a bailout," I explained as he read. "It's a framework for rebuilding your integrity, our relationship, your children's security." Thomas stared at the papers, blinking rapidly. "You've been planning this?" "Since last night," I admitted, "but I've had 3 months in Portugal to think about what matters most to me. It isn't revenge, Thomas. It never was." He looked up, eyes glistening. "I don't deserve this." "No," I agreed honestly. "You don't. But Lily and Sam deserve stability. Emily deserves a chance to rebuild her life without being punished for your mistakes. And I paused, searching for the right words. "I deserve the peace that comes from living my values, even when it's difficult." Thomas looked down at the papers again, lingering on the volunteer requirement. "Mom's ward," he said softly. I nodded. She always said the most valuable thing a person could give was their time. Not their money or their advice, their presence. "I said you were useless," Thomas whispered, the words clearly painful to repeat. "But the truth is, I've been the useless one, making money but not really contributing anything meaningful." The admission hung between us, fragile but genuine, not a manipulation to secure my help, but a realization that had been forming since his world began collapsing. "Sign if you agree to the terms," I said. "I've scheduled a meeting with Alvarez and Chun at 10. Thomas picked up the pen I offered, hesitating only briefly before signing his name at the bottom of each page. As he did, some of the tension seemed to leave his body. Not relief exactly, but the exhaustion that comes after accepting hard truths too long denied. "What about you?" he asked as he handed the papers back. Are you coming back from Portugal?" "Not permanently," I said, and saw him nod in acceptance of this boundary. "But I've rented an apartment in Lisbon for a year, with an option to extend. You and the family could visit at Christmas, if the legal situation allows travel." "Lily would love that," Thomas said. "She's been reading all your postcards to the family at dinner. Started learning Portuguese on her phone app." Something warmed in my chest at this unexpected connection with my granddaughter. "I'd like to see her before I leave, if that's possible. She's been asking about you. I think she guessed I'd found you when I came home less frantic yesterday." He hesitated. "Would you come to dinner tonight? Emily's bringing Sam back around 5. Nothing fancy, just family." Family, the word that had once been the center of my world, then a source of pain, now transformed into something new, more complicated, but perhaps ultimately more honest. "I'd like that," I said. 6 months later, I stood on my Lisbon balcony watching the sunset paint the red-tiled roofs of Alfama in golden light. Behind me, inside the apartment, I could hear Lily's delighted laughter as Teresa from the cafe attempted to teach her Portuguese cooking. Sam's voice piped up occasionally with questions, his natural curiosity undimmed by the family's changed circumstances. Thomas and Emily had arrived 3 days earlier for their Christmas visit, their first trip outside the country since the Westridge scandal had broken wide open. Thomas had ultimately avoided prison by cooperating extensively with investigators, though his professional licenses had been revoked, and he would never work in finance again. They had moved into the modest house I'd purchased in their old town, a significant downsize from their Tudor mansion, but comfortable and walking distance to both children's schools. Emily had returned to teaching part-time, while Thomas had found work managing a local hardware store, a job that seemed to give him more satisfaction than I would have expected. "Beautiful view," Emily said, joining me on the balcony with 2 glasses of port wine. She handed me one, the gesture more genuine than any interaction we'd had in years. The crisis had changed her too, softened some of her sharp edges, revealed a resilience I hadn't known she possessed. "It's why I chose this apartment," I replied, accepting the glass. "Reminds me of what matters." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds from inside, Lily explaining something to Sam, Teresa's melodic Portuguese instructions. "He's different," Emily said finally. "Thomas. This whole experience, it broke something in him, but maybe something that needed breaking." I nodded, understanding precisely what she meant. "He volunteers at the cardiac center every Sunday now, not just once a month," she continued. "Says it's the most important part of his week." "Margaret will be pleased," I said quietly. Emily turned to look at me directly. "You could have destroyed him, you know, after what he said to you, how he treated you. You had every right to walk away and never look back." "It wasn't about rights," I replied, watching a fishing boat navigate the Tagus River below. "It was about worth. My worth, not defined by usefulness to others. His worth, not defined by financial success." "And that's why you didn't just give him money," Emily said, understanding dawning in her expression. "The conditions, the framework, it wasn't punishment. It was teaching him what really matters." I had to alert myself first. I admitted selling the house wasn't just about escaping Thomas's expectations. It was about reclaiming my life on my terms, finding purpose beyond being someone's father or husband or future inheritance. From inside came the sound of a timer, followed by exclamations of delight. The aroma of roasting chestnuts and cinnamon wafted through the open doorway. "I think dinner's almost ready," Emily said, finishing her port. Before heading inside, she touched my arm lightly. "Thank you, Harold, not just for helping us, but for showing Thomas there's another way to live." Later that evening, after a meal filled with more genuine laughter than I could remember in years, I found Thomas on the balcony, gazing at the now-dark city illuminated by thousands of lights. "Lily wants to study abroad here when she's in college," he said as I joined him. "Says her cool grandfather can show her around." "I'd like that," I replied, genuinely pleased by the thought. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then, "I've been thinking about what you said about worth versus usefulness." He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "I spent so many years measuring myself by my salary, my title, my ability to provide materially. I measured you the same way. Most men of our generations do." I acknowledged. When it all fell apart, my job, our finances, I thought I was nothing. He shook his head slowly. "But then I started volunteering at the cardiac center. There was this elderly man, reminded me a bit of you actually, terminal condition, no family visiting. I just sat with him, played chess, listened to his stories." Thomas's voice grew thick with emotion. "His nurse told me those chess games were the highlight of his week, that my visits gave him something to look forward to. Me. Unemployed, disgraced, broke, I was still able to matter to someone. That's what your mother always understood." I said quietly. "That's what I had to leave to remember." Inside, Lily's laugh rang out again, followed by Sam's excited voice calling for his father to come see something. Thomas smiled at the sound. "I should go in," he said. "Dad?" I know I can never fully make up for what I said to you, but I want you to know. I held up a hand, stopping him. I know, son. We're finding our way forward. That's enough. As Thomas went inside to his children, I remained on the balcony a moment longer, looking up at the stars visible despite the city lights. I thought of Margaret, of our dreams of traveling together, of the unexpected journey that had brought me here alone, but not lonely. You were right, Maggie. I whispered to the night sky. It was never about the house. The path to reclaiming my sense of worth hadn't been straightforward or painless. It had required walking away, standing firm, and then, most difficult of all, finding the grace to offer a hand back to the son who had hurt me, not from obligation or usefulness, but from the strength that comes from knowing your own value. Inside my apartment, surrounded by the family that was slowly healing, I felt a peace I hadn't known since Margaret's death. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood what she had always tried to teach me. True worth comes not from what you have or what you provide, but from how you love, how you forgive, and how you find the courage to begin again. The next chapter remained unwritten, for all of us. But for the first time in years, I was genuinely looking forward to turning the page.